Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Roger, for these very kind words and for a fantastic introductory speech on the link between Hannah Arendt and citizens' assemblies. 2 weeks ago, 2,000 inhabitants of the city of Amsterdam found a letter on their doormat saying, and I quote from the letter in my translation, "Congratulations, you have been drafted by lot for a citizens' assembly and you are invited to advise the city of Amsterdam on which extra measures it should take to meet its climate objectives. Prior knowledge about the city or its climate targets is not required for participation." In just 2 weeks' time, early November, hundreds of them will kickstart their deliberations. They will learn from experts, they will learn from each other, and at the end they will come up with a number of concrete policy recommendations. And this will be Amsterdam's first formal citizens' assembly ever. Just yesterday, a citizens' panel of 50 Belgians was selected, representing the country's diversity in terms of age, gender, level of education, and place of residence. From next week on, this group of 50 will discuss Belgium's role in the European Union and how that level of transnational governance can be democratized. The project that goes on in Brussels is part of the Europe-wide Conference on the Future of Europe. It will be the very first formal citizens' assembly organized by the federal government of Belgium. Thirdly, earlier this year, the Bundestag, the German federal parliament, held its first government-led citizens' assembly, and 169 citizens from Germany came together to talk about Germany's role in the world and its foreign policy. And the Speaker of the House, Wolfgang Schäuble, the 79-year-old veteran of German parliamentary democracy, said to the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and I quote from that interview, "Everywhere in Europe and North America where Western democracy exists, we are witnessing an increasingly weaker cohesion of the model. The connection between voters and those who are voted in has become weaker. We in the Bundestag, we mustn't become a caste of our own. We should make our parliamentary democracy future-proof," he continued. And he added, "Citizens' assemblies can be an important step, not as an alternative, but as a reinforcement of parliamentary democracy." Now, these are pretty extraordinary words coming from the veteran of German parliamentary politics. He is the longest sitting member of the Bundestag in German parliamentary history. He's been there since 1971, saying now we should do something about the system if we want to keep the spirit of democracy alive. Meanwhile, at the local level in Germany, dozens of towns, cities, and municipalities have started organizing citizens' assemblies drafted by lot. And then fourthly, just half an hour ago, and I think you are the first audience in the US to hear about it, the City Council of Paris has started voting a bill enabling something even more daring: the establishment of a permanent citizens' assembly with 100 Parisians drafted by lot. It's almost too symbolic to be true. One of the most iconic cities in the world, the capital of the 5th largest economy in the world, votes for sortition-based permanent citizens' assembly on the day Hannah Arendt was born. Indeed, as Roger already said, Hannah Arendt would have turned 115 today, and I think she would have smiled seeing this upsurge of deliberative democracy, these spaces of freedom, and these sortition-based models. More than 70 years ago, she wrote a phenomenal text called Einführung in die Politik, Introduction into politics. Not just in politics, but into politics. And I have to say, it's the most impressive text I've read since I arrived in the US to lecture here at Bard College at the Hannah Arendt Center more than a month ago. The text was written in the second half of the 1950s, and like most of her groundbreaking work of that decade, it was written in German, but the manuscript was never published as a book. She was living here at the time, commuting between New York City and Kingston, just across from the river, and it never got published during her lifetime. It was only printed for the first time in German in 1993, and the English translation came out only in 2005. Some of the ideas were taken up in On Revolution, the book that was just quoted by Roger. And although the text is heavily conditioned by the time in which she was writing, the 1950s, which for her were marked first by the communist totalitarianism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and secondly, the threat of nuclear warfare and the potential of global annihilation, it is still a universal text, and a phenomenal one at that too. And although she never wrote about sortition herself, about lottery as an instrument, everything is already there. Knowledge about how sortition was used in ancient Athens, for instance, was still poorly understood in the 1950s. It was only in the 1990s, thanks to the work of the German scholar Mogens Hermann Hansen, that we got a detailed understanding of how the Athenians did it back then. So this is pretty recent knowledge. I once had the fortune of meeting Mogens Hermann Hansen during a breakfast at Copenhagen, and his erudition was absolutely staggering. At the time of Hannah Arendt's writing, there was one book available on the use of lot in ancient Athens. It was written in the 1890s, and yesterday I checked in the archive of the Hannah Arendt collection. She did have a book by the author, James Wycliffe Headlam, but not that one. So she seems to have been rather short of detailed understanding of sortition, but that doesn't take away that her text is an absolute trailblazer of what has become the movement for climate, or rather citizens' assemblies. First, it is already in the curious title of that text, Einführung in die Politik, Introduction into Politics. And introduction here is not meant as a sort of manual into political science or a sort of preliminary course on political theory. No, introduction should be understood in its literal term. It's about the fact of people being led into being political, of being invited to enter a political space, of thinking politically, of being invited to become a political actor yourself as a citizen. And the word action is key here. It's a key term in the Arendtian vocabulary, and it's a very important one when it comes to her definition of democracy. As a citizen, you don't just undergo policies that have been made from above. You are there as an active participant shaping the policies with yourself, with others, within a space that allows for exchange of arguments and debate. It's a crucial thought. And as she had witnessed the mindless and thoughtless embrace of the Nazi ideology in her native Germany, and this observation of thoughtlessness would become the cornerstone of her analysis on the Eichmann trial, she called for a radical rethinking of what politics meant. And to do so, she had to go down the historical ladder of political philosophy. This is my second point why I think her text is so important. She had to move beyond Marx and Kant, beyond even Christianity and the Roman Republic, even beyond Aristotle and Plato, even beyond the words of thinkers, to look at the deeds of citizens. She descended into time to look at Athenian democracy and how it functioned in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. And this movement of going back in time resembles somehow the gesture undertaken by her teacher Martin Heidegger, when he felt dissatisfied with the history of Western metaphysics and felt he had to return to the traditions of pre-Socratic thinking to address a question that had been forgotten throughout the history of Western philosophy. What was Seinsvergessenheit for Heidegger was a sort of political oblivion in the thinking of political philosophers Hannah Arendt was analyzing. She urged to descend into the abyss of time to look for the true meaning of politics before we can start thinking about political philosophy. And I quote from her text, and I think it's an amazing phrase. The question about the meaning of politics has hardly ever been asked in earnest since classical antiquity. She was disappointed by most political philosophy, and she thought that even the greatest philosophers, no matter how strong they were on metaphysics or epistemology or other fields of philosophy, were pretty weak on political philosophy. And she calls this the perversion of politics, or even the degradation of politics at the hands of philosophy. Pretty strong words. And she adds a line to it, and I want to quote her again. The degradation of politics at the hands of philosophy, familiar since the days of Plato and Aristotle, this depends entirely on the separation of the many from the few. The separation of the many from the few. I think that's a highly original thought. For her, trying to define politics is not about the individual or the institutional. It is about what she calls human plurality. It is about the many. Politics is not something that emerges in a person and is then dispersed to other persons. Now, politics is the dynamic that unfolds between persons, and that intra-individual aspect is key to her thinking. And for her, politics is not some sort of a necessary evil you need to have in order to get at freedom. No, politics itself means freedom. And for her, what she observed in ancient Athens was not politics done by a professional caste from above, but it was a space in which citizens came together to talk, to listen, basically to shape their future, to act, that is, to be free. The key phrase of her introduction into politics is, the meaning of politics is freedom. It's a bit of an unusual saying given the amount of hatred the word politics encounters today. The meaning of politics is freedom. Do not separate the many from the few. Do not relegate power to professionals, as this may risk the origin of thoughtless followers. Do not be satisfied with citizens controlling government, but go for citizens actually shaping government. Do not be satisfied with citizens looking up to their politicians to admire or to despise, but have your citizens looking at each other. And there is one quote which I want to read from her book, which I forgot to take. The text was published in a book called The Promise of Politics. This is the edition of 2005. This is what she has to say. Since for the Greeks, the public political space is common to all, the space where the citizens assemble, it is the realm in which all things can first be recognized in their many-sidedness. And the crucial factor is that one gained the ability to truly see topics from various sides, that is, politically, with the result that people understood how to assume the many possible perspectives provided by the real world. Briefly, it is all there. It has often been said that the theoretical groundwork for deliberative democracy, for citizens' assemblies, for sortition-led democracy, that that groundwork was formulated by Jürgen Habermas in the 1960s, the German sociologist, and by John Rawls in the 1970s, the American scholar. But if there is one thing I have learned during my stay here at the Hannah Arendt Center, it is that the real pioneering work was done by the woman who lies buried here 100 yards away already in the 1950s. She was the true pioneer. And I seize the occasion to praise the work of Shmuel Lederman, who is going to talk at this conference this afternoon, for his highly original work on Hannah Arendt and the origins of participatory democracy. So, does that mean that everything is solved now? Hannah Arendt called for citizens actively shaping their future in dialogue with each other, just like it was done in ancient Athens. And now, 70 years later, this is happening in Amsterdam, in Brussels, in Paris, in Berlin, perhaps soon in some of the towns of the Hudson Valley. All is well that ends well? I'm not quite sure. Yes, there is reason for some hope about the possible revitalization of democracy through sortition. I've been advocating for deliberative democracy for over 10 years now, and things have finally started to change and even to accelerate. The OECD published a report last year bringing together an analysis of citizens' assemblies having taken place over the past 20 years, and it documented more than 300. Over the past year and a half since that report was published, another 100 have been added to the list. So yes, we are witnessing an acceleration. I was personally involved with designing the permanent Paris Citizens Assembly that is now being voted, or that might already have been voted while I'm talking. It has been a fascinating experience, and I remember this summer working in Paris to see a younger generation of Parisian politicians asking experts to go even further in designing a model was quite a thing to witness. But all that does not mean that the battle is won. I see two major threats, an internal one and an external one. First, from the inside. Today's electoral democracies are in the process of weakening themselves, perhaps even of killing themselves. The lofty ideals of representative government, and Roger has been so kind to remind them, these lofty ideals have turned into the nightmare of party politics, with its ongoing and increasing carnival of ritual infighting, highly mediatized performances of difference, an exuberant sense of indignation, infantile stubbornness, and a deeply problematic financing model. A system that was meant to put power in the hands of the most virtuous or the most competent is today better at getting the worst out of elected representatives than the best. On top of that, social media, filter bubbles, fake news, echo chambers have all polarized entire nations. They have made the electoral fever into a permanent feature of democracy. They have deeply divided our communities. They have promoted conspiracy thinking. They have eroded trust, not only in government, but in each other. And all this is happening within the framework of neoliberal economies that have widened the gap between the rich and the poor, have disenfranchised entire social strata, and have created a sense of whatever you vote, it doesn't matter because the system isn't fair. When economics weaken the weak, when politics humiliate the humble, it comes as no surprise to see people flock towards those that make them feel proud again. It comes as no surprise to see people flock towards those that give them a sense of purpose, of belonging, and even of joy. And these forces are powerful forces. And I'm not quite sure whether some happy citizens' assemblies taking place in some cities or smaller countries of the world will be enough or will be in time to make a difference, even if they are successful in bringing reason, respect, curiosity, and genuine dialogue back into our democracies. Populist voters should not be confounded with populist leaders. They are not fascist yet, but they may become so if we continue to treat them as such. Perhaps populist anger could be redefined as a gift, but a gift wrapped in barbed wire. It's a gift that expresses a willingness of political participation. We can run away of the barbed wire, but we may also try to unwrap and disentangle that wire. Will the angry masses of the world become fascist? The answer to that question is in our hands. And we should wonder, would a working class man without a job or without a college degree, yet who had been given the chance to regularly speak his mind at a citizens' assembly, a place where he feels respected and understood and included as a citizen, would such a man still paint his face in red and blue and put on a Viking helmet before storming the Capitol? The second best book I read during my month here at Bard College was a copy of a book I bought in Herman Melville's house in Arrowhead in Massachusetts. And it's a book containing some of the last expressions from Walt Whitman. I want to read you from that book. One of his friends in the last years of his life took down his final words. This is what he had to say about American democracy. I think there's a great lesson in there for today. We can't get on with a world of masters. We want men, a world of men, backbone men, the workers, the doers, the humbles. We want them. They're like the crowd of the grave working men of our world. They are the hope, the sole hope, the sufficient hope of our democracy. Before we despair, we have to count them in. After we count them in, we won't despair. And then a second threat looming above democracy today comes from the outside. Hannah Arendt wondered whether politics as freedom was possible at a moment that the atomic bomb might destroy human civilization at large. And today, we have to ask ourselves whether deliberative democracy, as the creation of a new public sphere where citizens come together to talk and shape collectively their future, whether that attempt is still possible now that the climate crisis has begun to unfold. Our predicament is perhaps even more challenging. The clock is ticking, and we know what time it is. In the Cold War, one had to reckon with an abstract eventuality of a violent flash. But during global warming, we have to live with the concrete reality of a slow, time-delayed destruction. Is it too late to revitalize democracy? Given that the next 8 years will be crucial for curbing our greenhouse gas emissions, is it too late to come together and talk? Honestly, dear friends, I don't know. Part of me is deeply worried about this incertitude. Part of me remembers what the IPCC, the UN Climate Panel, said last summer. We will decide how warm it gets. And yet part of me remembers that most people want to live, and that a growing number of people are concerned about the future of the planet. Part of me remembers that in a number of countries, climate is no longer regarded through the dividing line of left or right-wing politics. Part of me remembers that last year, President Macron organized La Convention Citoyenne pour le Climat, the Citizens' Convention for the Climate. 150 French women, drafted by lot, came together for months to come up with 149 recommendations It was the boldest, most ambitious, and most coherent action plan for climate governance that France had ever seen. But part of me remembers also that the French public at large agreed with the majority of the recommendations. 82% of them even wanted to change the constitution to make climate change part of their constitutional text, their founding text. Yet part of me also remembers that only 15 of the 149 recommendations were enacted upon, and that the French government rejected more than half. And then again, part of me remembers that last week the world's very first global assembly was launched, a highly promising bottom-up initiative bringing 100 citizens of the world sampled by lot to talk about climate change. And during the breakout session at lunch, Margot Becker will talk about it. She's one of the organizers. Part of me hopes that the Global Assembly might become a permanent feature of the United Nations, so that every year in September, at the time the General Assembly is taking place, the General Assembly of Nations, there would also be a Global Assembly of Citizens. Because countries always think like countries, whereas citizens can think as citizens of the world. Dear friends, yesterday I went to visit the place where Hannah Arendt lies buried, here on campus next door. The afternoon light was filtered by the golden leaves, and the fallen leaves were cracking under my feet. And squirrels were running over the grass as if they had the eternal life. The meaning of politics is freedom, I remembered. And I almost wanted to say, thank you, Frau Arendt. And knowing that she abhorred any form of sentimentality, I would nonetheless have wanted to add, and happy birthday to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for an incredible talk kicking off the conference. It's really an honor and pleasure to have you here. And it was wonderful to hear you engage with that phrase, the meaning of politics is freedom. I mean, Hannah Arendt uses meaning in a very particular way. And it's not about truth. It's about meaning. For her, thinking is not something we find truth through, it's how we find meaning. And freedom is not about truth. It's about appearing. And so I think one of the reasons civic assemblies are so popular or have such have a real catch on with people is the word freedom. But one of the reasons they scare people is the word equality. Because if you bring randomly selected people in, you're not always bringing an equal group. You know, a jury is often dominated by one or two people. You know, we have an experience in a jury in the United States. And so and the way people go about this is they sort of try and fix the citizen assemblies, right? We should balance for gender, we should balance for race or age or income. And they become very sort of administered, as you said, experts, elites. And so I'm wondering, to what extent we see, how do we balance these competing claims of freedom and equality? And do you see citizen assemblies as about freedom, or are they about something else, like equality?
Thank you, Roger. To come back to your first question, it was also in your introduction. I wouldn't worry too much that the idea of citizens' assemblies are organized by elites, by sociologists, or political scientists, or philosophers, or politicians, or civil servants. Because this is also the case with education. This is also the case with healthcare. This is the case with many fields that are being shaped within a democracy. It is not about who is shaping these, who is creating the conditions for students to be able to learn or sick people to be able to get some of their expenses reimbursed. It is basically who is benefiting from this. And I think the fact that citizens' assemblies are basically, at the time being, this has started off as a philosophical and an initiative from political scientists. I mean, Hannah Arendt was the first in the 1950s, and then in the 60s and 70s, this is mostly academic thinking by sociologists and philosophers. And then later on, activists and academics have been enjoying this and putting this into practice. But we should remember the originality and even the generosity of people saying, we have certain political ideas, but they do not matter, because I would rather have a democratic decision-making against my own will than me imposing my own will. So the fact that it's scholars organizing this is not, I think, a strong criticism of citizens' assemblies. If these people are organizing conditions that make these free spaces, these spaces of freedom possible, I think that is what's key. And then the question on equality and representation, we had a discussion earlier this week on that one. Is it good or bad that when you draft a random sample of people, that you do a weighing? Is it good that there are certain criteria for gender, for age, for race, for level of education? Strictly speaking, you could say, well, a random sample is a random sample. If you have a country of 10 million inhabitants, you draft 500 of them by lot, and those who show up happen to be those that will be the citizens' assembly. But then you'll have such an overrepresentation, mostly of white men above the age of 50, a category in which I belong since 3 weeks. And given that the difficulty of some people accepting such an invitation because they are suffering from imposter syndrome, or they feel it's not about them and they don't have anything to say, I don't think there is any bad practice in combining two forms of sampling, random sampling and stratified sampling. And this is what's happening now. The process that is happening in the Netherlands, for instance, or that would happen in Germany, or in many cases, is a two-tier process, where you have a random sample, where a number of letters of invitation are sent to, for instance, 2,000 inhabitants of the city of Amsterdam. Then you look at the answers you get, and on the basis of that, you do your stratified sample. This is common practice in all sociological research, in all polling. Pollsters call this weighing of your sample. And I think it's good practice to make sure the diversity of your society is reflected in the diversity of your panel.
I want to push a little bit on both those questions, just because, you know, we need to push on these things.
I knew this was going to happen.
Yeah. So when Hannah Arendt was asked once, you know, well, what does citizens talk about in these councils? She said, I don't know, whatever they want. Mm. She saw them as spaces of freedom in that kind of sense, right? We say, we want you to come and talk about climate change.
Not true.
Or we want you to come talk about a septic tank in Pine Plains, right? And so there's already an agenda setting going on that is, and again, I'm also a white man over 50. I support these agenda settings. They're generally things I think are important.
Right.
But they do set the agenda. Yep. Similarly, when you bring in and you say, well, we're going to not have a random sample, or we're going to take a random sample and then use stratified sampling, which means we seek age diversity and race diversity and gender diversity and maybe geographic diversity and maybe other things. We're doing that for a reason. We're doing that because we want certain opinions or ideas, or assuming that certain people of a certain age might have certain opinions or certain things. You know, I did these videos, which you're going to be doing as well on Sortition, and one of my friends who's, you know, let's just say on the far right, watched it and said, I like this idea of sortition. That's something I could get behind. But I don't like stratified sampling because just do random. Just bring in the people who come. He says, once you start stratifying, we're not going to trust who the people stratify. We're not going to trust which categories are brought in, things like that. And so, again, this is not per se a criticism. It's attempt to understand that, you know, the sortition model is very much about creating institutions that will direct and help create a kind of elite-driven political participation. It brings in more citizen voices. I think that's great. It is a kind of space of conversation, but it's very regulated. Right. And I think we have to at least understand that.
I agree, and these constraints should be minimal. And I do agree with you that setting the agenda is a highly political deed. And many of the citizens' assemblies we have today, the topic has been determined beforehand, either by a NGO or a bottom-up citizens organization, or top-down by a government or a company for that matter. I think that's problematic. The thing that is going to be voted today in Paris is based on something we designed 2 years ago for the German-speaking part of Belgium, which is the very first permanent citizens' assembly in the world, where next to the elected parliament you have a permanent citizen senate drafted by lot. And there the agenda setting power is firmly in the hands of citizens drafted by lot. The first time I organized a citizens assembly myself was 10 years ago with the G1000. This happened at the moment Belgium was without a government for a year and a half. Try that. And there also we decided that it was not up to us organizers to determine what people should talk about. Agenda setting was done online beforehand by citizens. And for me, this is the way to go for. It's great that we have these one-off citizens' assemblies on particular topics, but I'm dreaming to take this on and turn this into permanent features with agenda setting power. Because you're quite right, it might be that the concerns of the elite will be reframed in the questions that are given to a citizens' assembly, and the agenda will be highly determined by the preferences of the political elites, and we should avoid that. In terms of stratification, I'm less worried than your friend, I guess. In the bill that was passed in the German-speaking parliament of Belgium, which was unanimously passed across the board from the extreme left to the far right, people agreed on 4 criteria. It was age, gender, where you were living in the geography, and level of education. And that I thought was quite original. Extra criteria could be added if need be. For instance, if a citizens' assembly was going to take place on farming, for instance, because it's a pretty rural region, there's a provision in the bill that allows for the creation of an extra criterion. And I think that's interesting. And it would even be more interesting, so who determines that that an extra criterion will be used? That might be, it could be interesting if citizens themselves would come up with that. And this is possible within the framework of the model that is being employed there. So the agenda and the criteria for stratification are not in the hands of political elites, they're in the hands of the citizens drafted by lot themselves.
I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up for questions both
Sure.
here and also on the web. If people on the web want to type in questions on the Q&A function, we will be able to recognize those. So, you know, in the last 5 years, I've been trying to catch up on citizen assemblies. I've told this story before. I had a student come in my office here at Bard about 5 years ago and said he wanted to write his senior thesis on sortition. And I looked at him and said, no. And he said, why? And I said, because I don't know what sortition is. And I do get the sense that most people still in the United States don't know what sortition is. I actually talked to a friend of mine in France yesterday, Thomas Chandler Williams. Some of you know him. He's spoken. He was actually the Hannah Arendt Center fellow 2 years ago. And he's living in Paris. And I said, you know, we're having this conference on sortition. He said, what's sortition? And he's in Paris and well, you know, very much follows the news. And so, you know, it's still something people are learning about.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm excited to hear to help teach and bring and popularize it. But when I read about it, there are usually two defenses of it that I come across. One is it increases or revitalizes democracy. So the subtitle of your book, at least in English, I don't know if you did this or your publisher did it, is...
The publisher did.
What?
The publisher.
The publisher, yeah, that's the way it usually works. The case for democracy. So one is, and I've sort of tried to suggest, I'm not sure if democracy is the right word. It's more citizen power, spaces of freedom. But that's one. The other is, and
citizens' power is just the English translation of the Greek word democracy.
Well, citizen rule is the translation, which is slightly different.
Okay, how would you define that?
Well, citizen power is where people gather and are able to talk freely,
right?
And who knows what comes of it?
Right.
Democracy is usually, at least, representatives are elected and make rules, at which point always a few are going to govern the many.
But the notion, and this is something that struck me in your introduction, the idea that deliberative democracy is opposed to representative democracy is something I would not agree with, because using a random sample of a population is also creating a representation. It's you could consider society as a big pan of soup. And there's two ways to taste the soup, with a fork or with a spoon. And the fork is the elections. I mean, that's where you get out the bits of carrots and chicken. And the spoon is the method with which you get out, that's the lottery part. That's when you get the liquid. But both are creating a form of representation of the overall soup. You get a flavor of it, and you get two different forms of representation.
Very much so. You know, Madison and Hamilton both said, and in some slides I put up, you know, representation is the core to Republican government. The problem we have right now, there's a lot of ways to think about it, but one statistic that Andrew Yang mentions in his new book, Forward, is that 83% of congressional districts in the United States now are safe districts. They've been gerrymandered to be safe districts, which means that you're only speaking to one party. Which means that whoever's going to win has to appeal to the activists of that party, which radicalizes politics. I don't know if that's the same problem you have in Belgium or in Europe, but here that is a huge issue. And the machinery of representation is being, in some ways, corrupted. But
well, gerrymandering might be a very interesting topic to be given to a citizens' assembly in the USA. It's a very curious practice, you have to admit. From abroad, I look at this and it's like shaping who is going to win beforehand. And I would be interested to see how an American Citizens Assembly would deal with the issue of gerrymandering.
I think it would be great. So, I mean, on the question of democracy versus representation and to what extent they're opposed, or citizen power versus representation, I mean, all I'll say is I think there's always going to be a tension. Because with citizen power, the model is self-government. Representation always is going to be some deviation from that. The point is to give as many people a voice as possible. I see that I see democracy creating new representations through sortition and citizen assemblies as one justification. I see what Hélène Landemore, who's going to be speaking tomorrow morning, giving the second keynote, calls collective intelligence. The idea that the citizen assemblies make the right decisions. There's a lot of work being done that this will end up with good decisions. And so we're going to hear about Ireland, where they, you know, citizen assemblies made possible both gay marriage and abortion. And with climate assemblies, the idea is they're going to make the right decisions.
I don't agree with that.
Yeah, well, okay. The Arendtian view is much more open, right? Which is
I would agree with
which is that it's not about making the right decisions.
No.
It's not about, you know, democracy in a sense of the people rule, but it's about empowering people to be part of the process. And the problem with that is, especially from an elite perspective, right? Who knows where it will end up? I mean, I think a lot of the initial skepticism people I tell about citizen assemblies have is, oh my God, you're going to let those people? But then you say to them, oh, well, it worked in Ireland, it worked on abortion, it worked on climate change, and people say, oh, okay, then I'll allow it. it's almost like the claim that it's going to be effective or lead to sort of liberal solutions is what makes people accept it.
Yeah,
and how do you, and will it? I mean, how do you address that?
I think that would be a very bad motivation if you are in favor of citizens' assemblies because they favor what happens to be your political ideology. I think that's highly problematic. I would be very afraid of a time where democratic innovation will happen across party lines, with the right championing referendums and the left championing citizens' assemblies. I think that would be highly problematic. And I'm quite interested, that's why I quoted Wolfgang Schäuble, the chair of the German Federal Parliament. He's a traditional right-wing Christian Democrat within the German political landscape. I think it's important that this is not just an ideal that is being pushed forward by people on the left. And I don't quite agree that citizens' assemblies are great for coming up with liberal solutions. I don't even think that they are great because people find the right answers. They are great because people make political choices. Democracy is not about solving conflict. It's about learning how to live with conflict. It's about managing conflict. It's trying to make sure that we find a way to deal with conflict before it becomes violence. And so factions will always be there. I quite agree with the founding fathers in that respect. I quite agree with Hannah Arendt in that respect. And I quite agree with Chantal Mouffe, the Belgian philosopher who works from London. She was criticizing John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, the so-called torchbearers of deliberative democracy after Hannah Arendt, we know now. And she found them a little bit naive in the idea like, well, you put people together and all participants will become brethren and come up with the right solution. Jürgen Habermas said like if you create a public sphere in which a herrschaftsfreie dialogue can take place, like a sort of non-authoritarian dialogue, people will come up with rational solutions. I don't think that's right. Passions are part and parcel of the political game. It is not because you enter the political space of a citizens' assembly, a room where a citizens' assembly are taking place, that your political passions are left at the door and you become a purely rational being weighing the evidence for or against nuclear energy or a sewage system in Pine Plains. So this sort of Rousseau-esque definition that of this sort of noble citizen, if only you put him in a citizen assembly and he'll be or she'll be a kind, civilized person. It's not. Sometimes discussions are intense, and that is how they should be. I often tend to think of citizens' councils as a form of couples counseling for a nation. And it's hard to do them when a nation is broken, but that's really when you need to do it. And people who enter this sort of counseling do not enter the room, the therapist's room, without their passions. They are there with their passions, with their frustrations, with their anger, with their dreams. And the process is meant to make room for these emotions as well. We did one on migration in Belgium, highly controversial topic. But the dynamic you get when you allow people to speak their mind in an environment where so many taboos have been installed, whatever your criticism on Belgian asylum policy, for instance, whatever remark you may make, you're easily branded as a xenophobic racist. It was liberating for people to have a chance to say, like, I'm not quite convinced that this is the way forward. I remember we did a simple tool, but I think it was a great tool. When we did this session on migration, the first people were seated at round tables of 10 each, and each table had a facilitator. This was a big room full of these round tables. And facilitators ask, if you think about Belgian migration policy now, you've heard some experts, you have your own expertise, you know what it's all about. How much on 10 would you give? Okay, you give a 6 out of 10. Okay, it's a 2, it's a 9. Nobody was blamed for giving a 2 or a 0. Because the next question was, what would it take to turn your 2 into a 3 or your 6 into a 7? So we're not talking about perfection, we're talking about relative improvement. For people, this was a liberating experience. I am invited to think on improvement. And then they had to write down individually, like, oh, these two measures would make a difference for me. Next step, talk to your neighbor. Look at what he or she has written down as measures and try to come up with a common idea. So this is how you go from individual emotions to collective preferences and collective priorities.
I think that's fantastic. And it's really about reteaching people the habit of how to actually have productive conversations.
Exactly, yeah.
We're going to try and have a productive conversation with all of you. If there are questions in the room, please do raise your hands. And there are microphones being passed around. So when I recognize you, someone will come and run a microphone to you. There's also, if there's questions from the web, you can send them in and Tara will let me know. Tracy, in the background over here, is there a mic for Tracy? Raise your hand so she can see, Elsa can see your mic. Please stand and say your name, and if you can, and I mean, in general. Well, I mean,
do you remember it?
If you're on the, I know it, but not everyone else does. And please keep your questions short.
Yeah, I'm Tracy Strong. I just one point of emphasis. This last point about
Mike,
not being a rational agreement is enormously important. What's being talked about is not Habermas, but something quite different. I had one reminder, which is in the Boule at Athens, it's not just everybody getting together. It was divided up under 10, there had to be people from each of the 10 deans. Inside the deans, there had to be people from each of the various areas. So there was a stratification built into the process, which was enormously important for the whole thing to work. The second thing that I wanted to say is, you said at one point, quoted, we will decide how warm the earth gets, quoting somebody. That can't be true. There's no we. That's the problem. Well, I would avoid that kind of comment, because the whole point you're talking about here is how do we get a we which is not based on sort of Habermas principles. The third point I want to simply add as a correction, which is you made nasty comments about political parties, which are quite true, given the present circumstance. But if you go back, and I'm not just over 50, but over that, if you go back to earlier periods, political parties functioned in a very different manner than they do now. And inside those parties, while they are not the kind of assembly that we're talking about, it was the case that people of different opinions, different passions, and so forth came together to agree on something in order to pursue what they found to be the public good. So part of the problem is, in fact, the change in the nature of political parties, and not just parties per se. Thank you.
I entirely agree with that last comment. And my remarks were just about how party politics has evolved now in what has been described as post-democracies. Very interesting what you said about stratification in the Athenian model. And it's true, the 10 deme had to be represented fairly within. So stratification was already there. Perhaps Roger could tell this to his friend on the far right, that at the very origins of citizens' assemblies, stratification was already part and parcel of the process. And then I was just paraphrasing the remarks of the IPCC at the end of last August, when the new report of the IPCC was being presented, where they said, like, well, it's dramatic. The anthropogenic origins of climate change are undeniable now, but it's still within the hands of humanity to determine how warm it will get. You should explore. You should expand upon that. You seem to have an answer to that question, which I don't see.
Can you give him a mic? Just let him follow up quickly.
A we is a group of people who are able to come to a collective decision. I don't know what it means to say that humanity can come to a collective decision. I don't know what it would look like. I can understand about an assembly. Okay. I can understand about the kind of institutions that you're talking about. Right. But humanity,
Right.
There is this, and Arendt is actually very good about the notion of humanity making a decision or crimes against humanity and so forth. There's a problem there.
I think this is really an interesting topic to talk during the breakout session when we'll be talking on the Global Assembly and see whether they succeed in making humanity speak. It's a major challenge. I mean, it's a challenge since Kant was talking about the idea of a world government. I don't have an answer to that question, but I'm very glad you raised it, and I think we're going to be talking about it during the breakout session. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to reference what Tracy is referencing is Hannah Arendt is very suspicious of world government. You know, she thinks all governments have the chance to be corrupted, and if you have a world government and it gets corrupted, you're in real trouble. So speaking about humanity may be a problem. Are there other questions? I see a bunch. I want to make sure I see both sides of the room. Over here, up there. Yes. Mark, is that Marco? Everyone's got masks on, so I can't see.
Hi, Marco Viscucci is my name. There are other ways in which citizens can make their voices heard, and I'm wondering where you would place them. You mentioned a referendum as being a right-wing tool. I'm thinking of polls, and I'm thinking of huge demonstrations which we have in this country in the streets, where people come together, whether it's on women's issues or diversity issues. I'm especially thinking of the abortion issue, where the polls show that the people in this country are in favor, a majority of the people in this country are in favor of Roe versus Wade, and also demonstrations. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And of course, there are other ways of letting people speak. I didn't say that the referendum was a tool of right-wing politics. I said I was afraid that we might reach a moment where right-wing politics would be favoring referendums and left-wing politics favoring citizens' assemblies, which is a different thing. I think they can be used across the board, and I hope they're going to be used across the board. I've recently, referendums, polls, demonstrations, these are all tools. Just last week I finished a paper on the preferendum, which is like a multiple choice referendum. So this is even another tool for making people speak. And I was making the case that citizens' assemblies could become more successfully implemented politically if they were followed by a preferendum. The 149 recommendations from the French Citizens Convention on the Climate were received with only very lukewarm attention by the French government, despite President Macron's promise that everything was going to be regarded sans filtre, without a filter. Well, they were strongly filtered. And imagine if these 149 recommendations would not have been handed over to the president, but would have become the object of a preferendum in which every Frenchman or French woman gets a list of 30 of these, and everyone is invited to rate and rank them, like we do already now when we have to determine which political party is best suited for me. But imagine you would do that sort of referendum, you might get a really interesting list of shared priorities on the basis of what the Citizens' Assembly has been recommending. It might be one way of making sure that the transmission from the panel to the post-panel, to the political implementation, is guaranteed. One of the key scholars in the United States on deliberative democracy is Jim Fishkin in California, and he started his career as a pollster, and I think he's been instrumental in setting up the first citizens' assemblies in the USA. He's done pioneering work, and he said, well, with a poll, you hear what people think when they don't have to think. Let us see what they think after they had a chance to think. And that's why he set up his deliberative panels, which he called deliberative polls. And what he was doing was, he did a poll with the participants beforehand, during, and afterwards, trying to figure out whether deliberation changed people's mind throughout the process. So he combined polling with deliberation to see whether the very act of speaking, the very act of entering a democratic space was altering people's opinion.
Thank you. Here in the middle.
My name is Thomas Barcher. And first I want to thank you, David, for the talk, which I particularly appreciated how local you made it. You brought your ideas to this place and concerns that are on concerns and aspects of our life here that are prominent, and I very much appreciate that. My question is I'm trying to understand what I think is a disagreement between the two of you, Roger and David, and I'll ask a question of each of you as a way of trying to understand it. As I understand Roger's concern to be about where power ultimately resides and how it's exercised. And in the United States, that I'll be talking specifically about the United States, it seems like it resides in the Constitution, which has certain constraints on the exercise of democratic power, of course, and also it specifies that the fork will be used to make the choices. And as I understand Roger's concern, if that's where power ultimately resides, then there will always be the problem that people will the criticism that elites are running the show for all of the Citizens Assembly will always be valid ultimately. And so, as I understood your response, you agree and you want to say, yes, that's why there should be no constraint on the remit that the citizens' assemblies have. And if ultimately they want to do away with liberties guaranteed by the Constitution, that's all right with you. And so my question is whether you do think there should be constraints on what citizens' assemblies can do, and if so, how, where, how is that done? And my question for Roger is, insofar as it seems like, if I understand correctly, you're still committed to the Constitution and elections, the citizens' assemblies then become sort of window dressing. Ultimately, they're not really deciding anything. They're just debating clubs, and that's not going to achieve what you wanted ultimately to achieve.
Okay. So thanks, Thomas. I think you've largely stated the tension in our, I don't know if it's disagreement so much as a tension in our approaches. It's a real tension, and we've talked about it over the last month and even for a couple of years. You know, I'm a constitutionalist in that sense, and believe strongly that while I like the word democracy in certain ways, and I believe that America is a democracy in its sort of in its social and political sort of foundation that everyone is supposed to be. Obviously, there's always going to be problems with this, but it's supposed to be equally empowered to engage in politics. I like Arendt, and like the founders, I'm also worried about you know, an unlimited democracy turning into a demagoguery or a tyranny. And so I do think we want to embrace democracy as the idea of equal citizen opportunities in action and power in politics, that everyone is to enter into politics, have an introduction into politics, but that I think that a meaningful political system needs certain institutional limits, and I don't think the Constitution as a piece of paper is the limit. You actually have to create power structures that limit other power structures. As John Adams wrote, it's only the power that can oppose power. You can't simply have a document, because people will overwrite the document if you let them. You need to figure out how to create opposing power structures. That's why I think federalism is such an important part of the United States constitutional system. And so I think it's important, as we develop these citizen assemblies and sortition ideas, that we be alert to empowering a democratic people, but also exploring particular institutional ways to create opposed power structures or multiple power structures, such that that will make it harder and unlikely for one faction or one part of the democracy to override others. And that's sort of the constitutional aspect of the approach that I'm trying to push. You talked about window dressing. I mean, I think, you know, in some way, that's what some people accused Arendt of saying, that these councils were just window dressing. She didn't think so. And I think the point is she found them to be sources of power. Now, she defines power as any place where collectives, multiple people get together and talk and decide to act in collective action. Demonstrations or civil disobedience is an act of power. So are debating societies. Insofar as the people in the societies may just get together and debate and say, we don't have anything to do. But sometimes they get together and they say, you know what, we need to fight, we need to resist. And power emerges. It may not be institutional power, but it becomes power that can oppose institutional power. You may have a governor that says you can't have a mask mandate, but you may have a school or a community that says we're going to have masks anyway. And then you have power facing power. That's what I think is essential in the American constitutional scheme. And that's what I'm sort of saying that's not a democratic idea. That's using democratic ideas of citizen power, but it's a civic republican idea, it's a constitutionalist idea that tries to create mechanisms that allow power to oppose power. So that's how I'm imagining it.
Actually, I share Roger's concern. I'm afraid, I'm unhappy when I see citizens' assemblies being used as a form of window dressing or just as a debating club. And sometimes, although I still think Macron was braving putting up this climate citizens convention, if you look at what has been done with the outcome of it, it feels like it was a lot of window dressing and a debating club. At the same time, it's the only country, to my knowledge, that has done such an ambitious example of a citizens' assembly on a national level on a major topic. And for future reference, it's handy, but it would be a pity if that would be the end of it. When it comes to, do you think there should be constraints on the workings of a citizens' assembly? I think I can respond with how we designed the blueprint for the German-speaking part of Belgium, the Ost-Belgian model, where it was clear that a citizens' assembly could deal with all the topics within the sphere of competences of that sub-state entity. As long as the recommendations remained within the limits of the Belgian constitution and of the international treaties that have been signed by Belgium. So there is indeed a framework that determines the space within which political action can take place. And I think that is healthy. Checks and balances and power and counterpower are essential to, I think, the functioning of a democracy. And I think we should remember the central idea of the thought of Claude Lefort, the French philosopher, saying that the seat of government should always be empty. I would be afraid of a democracy trying to go on without innovating itself and refusing any form of citizen participation. On the other hand, I would also be afraid if all current institutions were done away with and replaced by a single citizens' assembly. That, to me, would be centralizing power too much in the hands of too little an institution.
Thank you.
Do we have yeah. We need a mic down here for a web question from the web.
Hi, we actually have a very lively online web presence right now. So some of the questions are clustering around issues of labor and the economy. And for instance, Roberta Brown has asked if the decline of the labor movement has erased the voice of that sector. Another person, Jordan Rosh, has asked if we fetishize the working class man a bit too much in imagining these spaces. And a couple other people have asked about the role of the kind of corruption of the democratic sphere through the economy, and so what role basic income might play in complementing a role of citizen assemblies, if you can take those kind of as a group.
It's these questions have what Wittgenstein used to call family resemblance. They do partially overlap, but they don't constitute a single question. I think it's true in this country, although I'm not an expert on the union history, but the decline of the labor movement, I saw a fantastic documentary about it not quite long ago, it's true, has silenced a part of the American populace. And, but I'm not saying that citizens' assemblies should replace, it's a bit going back to the previous question, like what about referendums, what about polls, what about manifestations, what about civil disobedience? I think union action can exist next to, and next to citizens' assemblies. It's not a question of either or. Have we been fetishizing the working man too much? Maybe in my talk, I referred to the image of the guy with the Viking helmet. At the same time, if you look at the sense of theft that seems to characterize many Western liberal democracies, I think I read a fantastic book by, the name escapes me, on neoliberal economics and the humiliation of the working class man. And I think it's perhaps, well, rather than being afraid of fetishizing the working class man, let us enhance our empathy. I don't think we're in a stage that is too advanced. I think we're still in a too early stage of our empathy. So I would rather have more empathy than doing away with the bit of empathy that we still have left. And then, has there been a corruption of the democratic sphere by economics? I think so, entirely. I think it was Princeton who published a report a few years ago on the corporate policy, the policy preferences of the corporate world, the policy preferences of the American people, and the political action by the American government. And the conclusion was, and we should remember that Princeton University is not necessarily a Bolshevik think tank, the conclusion was that, by and large, American political action answered much more to the needs of the corporate class than to the wider masses of the American people. So yes, there has been a corruption of them, and we're not even talking about the financing system of political parties. So yes, surely that seems an obvious one. And I think this is a place where citizens' assembly may redress the balance. I'm dreaming of organizing citizens' assembly on the way parties are financed. Party financing is one of the problematic aspects, I think, of today's democracies, and why party politics, as Tracy just has pointed out, why party politics have changed so dramatically over the past years.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one or two questions. Are there students that have questions? I'd love to bring in a student. Is that a student in the back? All right, in the back there. It's hard for me to see.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm a senior here at Bard. I wanted to loop back to the earlier discussion about the relative power of citizen assemblies. How do we reconcile the work of citizen assemblies within or with representative governments or political leaders? How do we proceed when the aims or goals of these entities do not align, such as the example in, I think it was Paris, where a citizen assembly came up with 150, points to take with climate, and they weren't all adopted. How do we reconcile that? And thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. It's true. The Paris example or the French example is particularly enlightening. You had a package of recommendations expressed by the Citizens' Assembly, and then a very partial uptake by the powers that be. I think one of the weaknesses of today's Citizens' Assemblies is that they are one-off events. And once the Citizens' Assembly is over, participants go home, and the only thing that is there is a report with recommendations that is easily forgotten after. I remember there was one Citizens' Assembly done in a Brussels municipality, and somebody did some research on it 1 year later, and the person was interviewing politicians and civil servants, and everybody had forgotten about that report, apart from the two politicians who had been organizing it. So there's a real danger there. If people go home, their report is overwritten. Just what Roger said about any political text can be forgotten as long as there's no power. Now, when we are institutionalizing now, and it's only so far in the German-speaking part of Belgium, and after your question, I will check on my iPhone to see what has been voted in Paris, because that might be the second place. The great thing of making this a permanent feature is that once a report is ready, citizens do not go home. The citizens, the participants to the Paris Citizen Assembly will be drafted for a year, and they will have monthly sessions. I think it's 1 day a month they'll come together, and they will remind sitting politicians, the city council, the city government, of what has been decided during citizens' assemblies. And I think that makes sure, that guarantees a political transmission and uptake within the sphere of lawmaking. And let me now check and share with you the news, which is quite new for me as well, on what has happened in Paris.
While David's checking, is there one last question?
It has been voted.
Yes.
There we are.
All right. So there is now the second. This is, I guess, the second
place in the world.
Second place, a small part of Belgium, and now a big city.
So yeah, a small part of Belgium with 80,000 inhabitants, and now we're talking about a city with 2.2 billion inhabitants having a permanent citizens' assembly.
All right. One last question. In the back there on the left. Yeah, you. Is that Jonas? Who is that?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Jonas. I have a question that follows up Thomas Barcher's question on essentially on the difference of the extent of power that a citizen assembly could have. And I think maybe there's a way of concretizing that question a little more, where, Roger, you're saying that there are these spaces, political spaces, that we're lacking, that citizen assemblies could maybe recreate within a constitutional framework. And the question would be, where exactly are those? And then for David, the question for you would be, you have now 2 permanent bodies of citizens' assemblies. How do they relate to the respective constitutions in those countries? Thank you.
We have like 2 minutes or 3 minutes. So.
Okay. The model in the German-speaking part of Belgium was voted unanimously. It has become an institution of in the working architecture of that polity. The Belgian constitution is quite a difficult one because it forbids forms of citizens' consultation. So the Citizens' Assembly can only give an advice, but it's a fairly constraining device. Politicians have to see the participants over a year, and within the year they have to respond as to what they have been doing with the recommendations. And if they have taken another course of action, they have to motivate in writing why they steered away from what the citizens decided. In Paris, this has been, I think, part of the interior rules of how the Paris Citizen Council functions.
So just very quickly, and I have not fully worked up a proposal, but there are interesting ones out there. David's done some and others. My basic thought is, you know, we should have, you know, I don't know, we should have a citizen assembly for every 100,000 Americans, something along those lines. And, you know, take a percentage of them, 15, 20, 100, and they should meet. And then each one of those should be selecting 1 or 2 people who go up and meet for every 500,000 Americans or whatever, 1 million. And then they should going up, and there should be like, it should be a constant thing that every year, X number of people are in these, having these debates, having these discussions. And it should just become something you do every, you know, well, whenever you're selected, like jury service. That's why I know David doesn't love the word jury as much as assembly, but I like the idea of citizen jury. It should just become part of what it means to be a citizen. And I think we need to make them less exceptional, more permanent, but also on a much more, on a much lower basis. I think that could be an incredible addition to, a complement to the representational electoral system in the country. It wouldn't fix it, but it would give citizen voices a platform that they don't have, and multiple platforms, which is what I think is needed. So we're out of time at this panel, but we have 2 days, and there will be a breakout session at lunch today that David is going to be on along with Jonas and Margot Becker, talking about citizen assemblies and global assemblies. Please join me in thanking David van Reybrouck.
Thank you.